Today, I would like to talk about kind of the ethics behind this social quarantine and if there are any actual implications that will go into effect that will affect the rest of our lives, potentially even worse so than the coronavirus itself. Is this social distancing as important as we think it is, and is it as effective as we think it is? What are the ethical implications of all of this? So I want to bring up a few points that this social distancing is affecting a lot of minorities and poor people far more than it's affecting anyone else. Big businesses aren't necessarily suffering because they already had these websites set up and they already had savings, or they get higher tax refunds, whatever it may be. It's the small local businesses that once those doors close, they'll be closed forever. And it's the poor and the minority groupings that are experiencing the most backlash of all of this. We've seen a huge increase in the number of suicide rates. Domestic abuse has gone up. Just for an example, in New York alone, there was a 15% increase in domestic violence incidents in March and a 30% increase in April. And one of the hardships of being in a domestic violence relationship right now is that you can't leave it. How is this affecting everyone? You also have to think about the neighborhoods that are already in tight congregation. Those people are going to be highly susceptible to contracting the virus, and those are going to tend to be your poor neighborhoods. How does it affect small houses with a ton of kids, maybe a single mother with 8 kids and their local park just closed down? How does that affect our youth? How are the kids that are growing up today going to view the world afterwards? Are they going to have normal social relationships? How are they going to think of the world? Are they going to be okay just going over to their friend's house to play? Are they only going to want to stay indoors for the rest of their lives? We're seeing an increase in new developments of anxiety-related disorders, depression. One telemedicine company called Talk Medicine, their psychotherapy telemedicine, their volume has gone up 65% since the original announcement. I think that the question that comes up into play right now a lot is your health more important than my freedoms? But we're also not just talking about physical health, we're talking about mental health. How do you choose a grouping of people's physical health over a grouping of people's mental health? Because at some point they're just one and the same. And I want to relate the idea of social distancing to one of Kant's arguments about lying. So essentially the argument is that a world where it is morally acceptable to lie is a world where lying stops working as an efficient means to its ends. If we're going to make it morally unacceptable to break social distancing protocols, so it is bad and unethical to leave your house with those in place because you're affecting other people's health, well, then it is essential for people to follow those rules most of the time. Otherwise, it's ineffective, which makes complete sense. It can only work where most people follow it and most people believe it's important. And the second you start seeing more and more people agree that we can go without social distancing, then it will no longer work as what it is supposed to be. Another thing I would like to do is kind of adapt the coronavirus situation to a test case we talked about using the sheriff. As you can see on this slide, this is the kind of parameters surrounding the sheriff test case. So utilitarianism is essentially a guiding principle that the action that is morally correct is the one that promotes the most happiness. And hedonism says that happiness is pleasure and pain is evil. So the actions that provide the most pleasure and the most happiness to the most amount of people is the correct and the morally right action. Rule utilitarianism, Mill argues that actions should be judged by the consequences of the rule it allows, and not the actual consequences of the action. While act utilitarians believe that if you look at the consequences of the actions, that is how you can determine what is morally right and morally wrong. So Bentham claims that an action is morally right if it increases the overall pleasure, and that is just based on whatever act you make. So how rule utilitarians would view the sheriff test case is they would say you cannot sacrifice that innocent person because that is immoral to let sheriffs make the call of whose life is more important, even though if he doesn't sacrifice the innocent inmate, then all of these innocents will die during the mob. It's not his choice to make. What kind of rule would it be if we said that sheriffs could choose between sacrificing this innocent versus this innocent? So if we adapt this to, again, our quarantining situation, where instead of an innocent out-of-towner that we're sacrificing kind of the sanity and the daily lives of people that are unlikely to die from COVID-19. Essentially, the social distancing is sacrificing my daily life. It's sacrificing what I like to go out and do. It's sacrificing my social life, my college experience, high school graduations, college graduations. It's sacrificing milestones. It's sacrificing sanity, mental health, and by sacrificing these things, we're saving the elderly. Rule utilitarians would most likely say that it's still immoral for the governors or the government to enforce social distancing, because then that gives the government permission to decide what is more important for people. That is allowing them to say, oh, yes, this group of elderly people who are subject to death if we do not enforce social distancing, their lives are definitely more important than your mental health and even domestic violence cases and those suicide cases. And that gives them the ability to say what is more important. So a rule utilitarian would say that no, social distancing is not ethically okay, because it's not okay for us to live in a world where the government gets to decide what type of health is more important and whose health is more important. Now, it's a little bit more difficult to determine what an act utilitarian would say, because at first glance, it feels easy to say that an act utilitarian would definitely encourage quarantining because it minimizes suffering. And that's the overall goal, ethically speaking, is to increase pleasure and minimize suffering. And if we do not social distance, then a lot more people will suffer in a shorter amount of time, in a condensed form. This becomes more tricky because if one person feels that they would be happier acting as if no quarantine was in place and that they just went outside and derived more pleasure from going outside and hanging out with their friends and doing their usual daily activity, then Bentham thinks that it is their moral obligation to do so. That even if there is a social quarantine in place, that if you think you would be happier doing something else, it is your moral obligation to actually go do that something else, regardless of the implications it has on other people. And if everyone was doing what they thought would make them happier, then the pleasure would increase, but so would the suffering in some cases. So at least for me, it's a little bit more difficult to figure out what an act utilitarian would say in this situation. From a social contract theorist perspective, I think it would also make a lot of sense to social distance, because it's in everyone's own self-interest to keep their space to avoid getting the virus. So to reference one of our readings, The Idea of a Social Contract, Thomas Hobbes says that morality is the solution to a practical problem that arises for self-interested human beings. Continuing on with this, the reading says that morality exists in the set of rules governing how people are to treat one another, and that rational people will agree to accept for their mutual benefit on the condition that others follow those rules as well. So it is in everyone's own self-interest to keep their space to avoid getting the virus. And in that way, a social contract theorist would say, yes, definitely quarantine, because it will benefit you and it will benefit me. And if we both complied, then we're both benefiting. And so that makes the most sense. However, it is not so black and white. If we look back at the real sheriff's test case, that inmate would never consent to sacrificing his own life to save however many people that would have died in the riot. He would never say, yes, you can kill me, even though I am innocent. That would just never happen. He doesn't want to die. He wants to live. And because he would not consent, and because one party will not consent, then a social contract theorist would say, no, that is immoral and it is unethical to then sacrifice that person unless they consent. And so then if you, again, bring this back to Corona and our social distancing adaptation, I think that there are plenty of young people who right now are not consensual to sacrificing their own freedoms and their mental health and their daily lives and the entire state of the economy in order to save a group of people from dying from the coronavirus. And in this case, then the social contract theorist would say, no, it is not morally ethical to social distance because not all parties are consenting to the repercussions of the social distancing efforts. And so again, it gets a little bit fuzzy because it depends on what way you're looking at it. If you're looking at social distancing from the perspective that it's saving more people than it is hurting, then yes, I think that morally it is acceptable. But once you kind of dig into the roots of social distancing and the repercussions and the side effects, I think you see that it is not so picture perfect as it may seem. And I think that a lot of people at this point are misinformed. And I'm not saying that social distancing isn't the right method of solution. It wasn't the right method of solution. I'm saying that there's no way to know. And I'm saying that it is important to look at every aspect of what's happening. How many people have died in response to it, right? I mean, even the people who were on their deathbeds that maybe would have lived if they had just had a family member holding their hand, giving them a will to live. I think there's not enough information out there, or not enough easy information out there to properly inform everyone, because there are a lot of people rooting this on without any knowledge of how other people are being affected. Just because you're doing okay with the quarantine doesn't mean that everyone is. Some people are suffering way more than they would have if this was not there. And I think that it is important to look at all cases and not just the good ones. So there is unfortunately no answer to whether or not social distancing is the proper and most ethical solution to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that it is not going to be known for some time. I think that there's no way of knowing what the proper response was until all of this is over.